evening, everybody who's here. Apologies for the slight delay. Our first speaker hasn't arrived yet, so we're trying to find out what's happened to him. But we have rejigged the order of speakers, and we're all organised now. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending this meeting. I'm Esther from the Socialist Labour Network. We have comrades with us from Jewish Network for Palestine, and this is a joint meeting with them. The meeting this evening has been arranged in the context of, there was a Jonathan Friedland article about Weber in his book, The Man Who Escaped Auschwitz to Try to Warn the World. And Tony's written a review of the book, and I think it's probably useful if you can all read that. As Tony says, to judge by its weaponization of the Holocaust and its war propaganda, people would be forgiven for thinking that during the Holocaust, the Zionist movement worked relentlessly to try and rescue Jews from Hitler's clutches, yet the reverse is the case. And this evening, we will hear from speakers with very relevant perspectives on this issue, from Holocaust survivors, academics, and authors. We are going to listen to our 3 or 4, if Stephen arrives, speakers first of all, and then we will have a 10-minute break, because I want to offer the opportunity for members of the audience in the webinar to post on the Q&A. We'll have a 10-minute break so that we can answer those questions, and you can have a cup of tea. We'll try to answer as many of the Q&A in the Zoom as we can. Then we'll resume with questions being put live from the floor, and we'll do that for 30 minutes. And then at the end, we will have each of our speakers with 5 minutes or so summing up their perspectives on the discussion in the meeting, having heard from the other panelists and having heard from the people in the webinar. So without more ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Tom Swareth. Tom has written and lectured extensively on the Palestinian issue, including at major UK universities and the UK House of Lords. He's known for his 2016 book, State of Terror, and Ilan Pappé describes this book as the first comprehensive and structured analysis of the violence and terror employed by the Zionist movement and later the State of Israel against the people of Palestine. Tom's other books include Writings on the Wall, Palestine Hijacked, and Palestine 60 Years Later. I was also delighted to hear that Tom is a former faculty member of Palestine's National Conservatory of Music and is a concert violinist. So welcome, Tom, and over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll jump right in and in the interest of time and say that in my view, the question we face is to explain how a past genocide, one that correctly gave rise to the term never again, is itself being wielded to grease the wheels of a genocide again. I'll start with some blunt, colorful language simply as a shortcut, but which I do mean seriously in regard to what we're up against. Zionism is a cult with all the negative connotations of the word, and it is as if we all live inside the cult's compound. The entire so-called West is its compound, and so we are fighting Zionism on its own turf. More colorful language just as a shortcut, the high altar of the cult, in my view, the drug upon which it is addicted, upon which its very existence depends, and thus it must ensure it never runs out, is anti-Semitism, whether real or fake. And the exploitation of the Holocaust is the ultimate distillation of that drug, which it must never let run out. Zionism has hijacked the Holocaust. It claims to own the Holocaust in order to use it as extortion, blackmail, to further its own racial nationalist crimes. No degree of Zionism's violence against the Holocaust seems to jog the media from its trance. It is so farcical that My favorite example is several years ago, a Daily Mail headline. The headline itself reported that Jews feel as threatened as they did in the Holocaust, experts say, an obscene insult to the memory of the Nazis' victims for Israel's benefit. And the respectable media are very little different, with headlines this year about London's Jews fearing for their lives and now the alleged pogrom in Amsterdam. All of it is for one reason only, to shut us up about today's genocide. In the wake of October 7th last year, we were continually fed the following edict. October 7th was the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. 76 years of manufacturing our consent is contained in this mantra. The problem with it is not statistics, whether in fact was the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. And ironically, if there are challengers for the ghastly distinction, it was probably at the hands of the Zionists themselves. And forget that many of the Israelis killed were military enforcing the deadly siege. Forget that many of the civilian victims were killed by the IDF. And forget the supreme irony that the reason the victims were Jews is that Israel had ethnically cleansed the region of non-Jews and only allowed Jews to settle in their place. The problem, rather, is the purpose of this mantra, which is to plant the lie that October 7th, and in parentheses, everything that has happened since, is rooted in hatred of Jews, reinforcing the carefully nurtured libel that Palestinian liberation itself is somehow tainted with anti-Semitism. The irony goes still deeper because it is the Zionists who are guilty of targeting Jews because they are Jews. Zionism not only failed European Jewry during their most desperate hour, but added to the horror. Even after Kristallnacht heralded the beginning of the Holocaust, Zionists, and Ben-Gurion specifically, fought against safe haven for Jews unless it was in Palestine. I'd like to mention one well-known incident from late 1940, the immigrant ship Patria, which the Jewish agency blew up while it was docked off the Palestinian coast, killing an estimated 267 people, most of them Jewish refugees who had just fled the war. Now, they bombed it not to kill them, but to keep the refugees in Palestine rather than the proposed safe haven on Mauritius. The point is that they were indifferent to how many it might kill in the process. To me, it is revealing that to cover up its mass murder and turn it to their advantage, the Jewish agency spread the lie that the refugees themselves blew up the ship, a mass suicide because the refugees were such devoted Zionists, which is to say cult members, that they would rather die than not go to Palestine right away. This narrative, this lie, was spread so successfully that it spawned a whole genre of plays and other works reenacting this self-sacrifice, this mass suicide for the Zionist cause. The tactic of supposed willingness to commit mass suicide in the service of the cult, like a modern-day siege of Masada, is also seen in the DP camps in 1946. After the war, the Zionists coerced the Allies to segregate Jews from all other displaced people into Zionist-run camps, where they were literally brainwashed and beaten into the cult playbook, such that when a US-UK committee visited them in 1946 and asked if they might like to emigrate to the United States, which had always been the favored destination, they replied in unison, in absolute terror, that they would commit mass suicide if they had to go to the United States. Many Jewish children whose parents had perished were being raised in adoptive European families. And so, at the same time the DPs were being subjected to psychological torture in the Zionist camps, the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of the Palestine settlements, a Rabbi Herzog, ran a kidnapping operation in Europe, forcing the children from their families, making them orphans for a second time, to ship them to Palestine as ethnic fodder. Herzog's fiercest opposition came from local European Jewish leaders who tried to protect the children by refusing to divulge their whereabouts. But Herzog used political force to circumvent them whenever he could. The kidnappings were rationalized by others at the time on the grounds that, well, as terrible as it was to tear the children away from their families, it was understandable that Herzog would want them to be in Jewish families rather than Christian families. Now, as Herzog himself said in justification for what he was doing, he said that for a Jew to be raised as a Christian is, his quote, much worse than physical murder. Now, think what you want of that in theory, but it too was a lie, because the Zionists were also stopping Jewish orphans still in the camps from reaching their Jewish adoptive families in England in order to ship them to Palestine as well. Zionism was over everything. Jews and Jewish suffering were Zionism's trump card, its fuel for its settler state. Jews and others perished at the hands of the Nazis because of Zionism. I'll cite one particularly clear example from late 1942 during the height of the Holocaust, involving the efforts of Solomon Schoenfeld, a British rabbi who had been a primary figure in the Kindertransport that had saved many Jewish children's lives on the eve of the war, and that Ben-Gurion, by the way, opposed because the children were going to England, not Palestine. Schoenfeld worked to get the British government to arrange safe passage for Jews and others, interestingly, he included and others, who were in Axis territory. Inertia for the project grew quickly, but with passage of the rescue effort in sight, the Board of Deputies of British Jews, assisted from the United States by Stephen Wise and the World Jewish Congress, intervened and scuttled it, and admonished Schoenfeld in no uncertain terms, that's a quote, that they would do whatever was necessary to stop the rescue. Now, Wise himself had just held a press conference days earlier in the U.S. Capitol to spread the alarm that the Nazis planned the extermination of European Jews. They all knew about the death camps, but the rescue project worked against Zionism. A 1943 report by U.S. intelligence described, quote, Zionism in Palestine as a type of nationalism which in any other country would be stigmatized as retrograde Nazism. Indeed, the very same doctrine of blood and soil is being inculcated. It permeates the main Jewish, here meaning Zionist, systems of education. Now, presciently, the U.S. report said outright that anti-Semitism was essential to Zionism. The prominent journalist Robert Welch, who had fled the Nazis, warned that Zionist leaders, quote, have not yet understood that the enemy seeks the destruction of the Jews. We, who have been here only a few years, we know what Nazism is. Zionists, rather, are taking part in the crash of European Jewry only as spectators. The senior inspector of Jewish schools in Palestine, in great secrecy, risked his life to warn about the threat of Zionism, also describing it as a parallel movement to Nazism and alluding to its cult-like nature. Behind closed doors, the Jewish Agency, which the nascent Israeli government, discussed its enemies. Its enemies were democracy, the Atlantic Charter, which of course became the basis for the United Nations, Reconstruction. They were afraid that with the improvement of conditions in Europe, the pressure on Palestine would subside, and they feared, yes, a fall in anti-Semitism. Ben-Gurion lamented that, quote, his quote, the democracies, in contrast to the dictator states, recognize the Jews as people having full rights of citizenship. This was a problem. And the agency blamed what it believed to be declining anti-Semitism in the United States on what it called America's democratic attitude. Even regarding the Allied war effort, the Zionists consistently placed their ideology above the struggle to defeat fascism. It lobbied the Yishuv, the Jewish settlers, not to join the Allied forces unless Britain formed a segregated Jewish army that was an encumbrance on the war effort, but that the Zionists could then use to claim that it was an implicit acknowledgement of Jewish nationality and therefore state. This, of course, resulted under U.S. pressure in the so-called Jewish Brigade. The Jewish agency conducted a massive theft ring of Allied weapons and munitions, as if, to quote one British military record, as if paid by Hitler himself. It continued its terrorism in Palestine, taking resources and personnel away from the war effort. The British, by the way, begged the Zionists to stop their terror until Hitler was defeated, but to no avail. Moving on to the last year of the war, in 1944, U.S. President Roosevelt arranged for safe haven and new homes for 500,000 displaced people, more than half of these to be resettled evenly between the United States and Britain. Again, once the plan was headed for success, U.S. Zionists sabotaged it. After the war, the charade of the vessel Exodus is another saga of Jews manipulated for Zionism. The entire charade was grand theater, for which safe haven was sabotaged, and the horrific return to Germany was forced upon the refugees by the Jewish agency, and in this case, specifically Golda Meir. After statehood, one person who had saved the lives of thousands of Jews from the death camps, Folk Bernadotte, was assassinated by Israel because he insisted on fixed borders and the return of the refugees, the right of the refugees to go home. And documents classified in recent years have all but proven what was long suspected, that the Lehi, the Stern Gang assassins who were working freelance for Ben-Gurion and future Mossad director Reuven Shiloah, not Lehi. It was the Israeli state that assassinated Bernadotte. And in the early years of the state, Holocaust survivors were framed by Ben-Gurion for atrocities committed by the IDF. One example being the infamous Kibbutz massacre of 1953. Opposite of its sales pitch, Israel and the Zionist movement are the cynical exploitation of the memory of Hitler's victims. And in my view, we must do whatever we can to make this part of the mainstream discourse. We must work to bring this into common language, because it is true and it is one of Zionism's main Achilles heel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. I learned a lot from what you said there, many shocking pieces of information. And there's a comment in the chat, and we've come across this issue before about Christian Zionists, because we see that anti-Semitism is necessary to Zionism, but what is Zionism necessary for? And of course, one thing that Zionism is necessary for is the beliefs of fundamental Christians, but it's more than that. So I hope we might address that during the discussion later. So thank you, Tom. Our next speaker is Chaim Brashith, and I'm really delighted to see you here, Chaim, today. And I know about some of the recent trials and tribulations you've had following your speaking for Palestine, and saying that Israel has no chance of winning its war. So Chaim is a retired professor, and he's author of a book called An Army Like No Other. Chaim is a child of Holocaust survivors and the founder of the Jewish Network for Palestine. We're having this meeting jointly with the Jewish Network for Palestine. Chaim's actual words, I believe, you said something along the lines that Israel cannot win against Hamas. I'll post a link to your speech as well at that meeting. But thank you very much for joining us this evening, Chaim, and over to you.
Thank you. Like Tom, I will mainly choose one story to tell the bigger story. The story that I'm going to tell, I consider one of the worst ever in the history of post-Judaism and the Holocaust. There are three main heroes who are statesmen, and three other heroes who are not. Well, the first one is Adolf Eichmann. The the second one is Moshe Sharrett, the Israeli foreign secretary at the time. But before the state was installed, yeah, he was the foreign speaker for the Jewish movement, the Zionist movement. And Lord Moyne, who was murdered in Cairo in 1944. And of course, in the background, Joseph Stalin. The lesser figures, but not less important ones, are Rudolf Kasztner, Yoel Brandt, and Kurt Becher. I'm sure you haven't heard the names of any of them, most of you. So this is a story of the Jews of Hungary in 1944. The Jews of Hungary did not suffer in the Holocaust very severely until March 1944. There are many reasons for that. One of them is, the main one, is that Hungary was basically on the side of the Nazis. It was a Nazi country. And not only that, it supplied the main munitions to the Wehrmacht. And who supplied it? The Weiss industries that were owned by a Jewish family, Weiss. And that family only left Hungary just before things got very badly in 1944. So you've got this amazing situation. Hungary, basically a partner of Nazi Germany, with a Nazi regime, or proto-Nazi regime. The Jews are not actually in camps, but they live in their own homes. And most of the men are serving in the Hungarian army in secondary, you know, they were really beasts of burden, but they were part of the Hungarian army. So they were not fighting in the front line, but they were serving the fighters. To actually destroy the Jews of Hungary, which was the very job of Eichmann, and this was the last country that still had Jews free Jews in the war. Eichmann moves from Vienna to Budapest, and the SS takes over Hungary in March of 1944 to do that. Now, Eichmann was not stupid, and he already had quite a few years of experience of destroying Jews. And one thing he knew is that the Jews, especially in Budapest, are basically middle class. They were most of the middle class of Budapest, and as such, they lived in middle class areas. There was no way, it wasn't, they didn't live in a ghetto. They didn't live in one area of Budapest. So how do you actually find them? What, you go from door to door? So that was the first problem that Eichmann had, and he knew about it, and he worked out a way of resolving it. The Jews had a Jewish council, a Judenrat, but of course, even the Judenrat couldn't control the Jews very easily. So Eichmann worked out an amazing program, which was 100% successful. He called the Judenrat to a meeting with him on the second day that he was there, and he told them, it's in your hands. I'm going to take all the Jews and send them to Auschwitz if you don't play ball. If you play ball, there are things for you to earn from this deal. Most of the Judenrat was very disturbed by this, but Eichmann immediately recognized that one person is a very good one to work with, and that's Rudolf Kasztner, a lawyer that was part of the Zionist movement, while some of the other people of the Judenrat were not Zionists. So he realized that the Zionists are very organized and knew that, and they can actually do what he needs. And he came to, over 2 or 3 days, if I remember, he came to an understanding with Rudolf Kasztner, who was someone that liked money, women, and power. And all those three will come up in the story. And at the same time that he had the job of killing the Jews, he also had from Himmler a message to the British and the Americans. And he worked out a way of doing all those things in one go. He told Kasztner this. He needs to get a message to the British and the Americans, and who better than a Zionist that will deliver that message? And he offered to Kasztner to send him to Palestine, from where he could get to Egypt very easily on the train, because Palestine was under the British. And he will need to talk to Lord Moyne, the British governor of Egypt, and give him this proposal. Now, you remember that in March 1944, the Russians were very close. They were, about a few hundred miles away from Auschwitz, for example. They actually already defeated most of the choice units that were sent to the Soviet Union. In a sense, what Himmler came with is a genius project. He came up with NATO. It wasn't called that. He wanted a Western alliance against the Soviet Union. And how to achieve that? So first of all, I'm saying this so easily. It's not a simple thing to say that NATO is a project of the Nazis, but it was. He offered the deal, which is called, $1 million for the lorries, or all kind of names. But this is the name that most people know it by. He said to Kasztner, this is the deal to offer Lord Moyne. There is 1 million Jews in Hungary. I offer it to the British, this whole community, for 100,000 military lorries that will only be used against the Soviet Union. And they have to be given by the Americans and the British to Germany. Now, just think about that. Think about the chutzpah, but also the genius idea of separating the Allies, and secretly, of course, and tell Moyne that we will never, that Stalin will never know that you gave us those lorries. We will defeat Stalin for you, and then we will have an anti-communist alliance, and that'll be the end of the war. Kasztner didn't want to go. He had other plans, but he knew someone that would very easily fall into this trap, because Kasztner immediately realized that this plan has no chance of ever being accepted. And he chose his second in command, Yoel Brand. Brand was a very, very avid Zionist, younger than Kasztner, excellent person. In any job that you gave him, he excelled. And he had another very important characteristic that Kasztner liked. He had a beautiful wife that Kasztner really wanted to have. So to send Yoel Brand to death, which is, that's what he believed will happen, or at least send him so far that he'll never be able to see his wife again. That was the plan. Eichmann accepted it, and Yoel Brand was put on an SS plane, flown to Turkey. And from Turkey, he took the train that in those days went all the way through Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, all the way to Egypt. But in order to make sure that this plan actually works, they sent an SS spy to tell the Zionists in advance that, a Zionist messenger is coming with this important message, that they might not get not respect from a Nazi spy, but they will definitely respect it from Yoel Brand, which they knew, of course. So Yoel Brand takes the train, and in Syria, the Zionist delegation meets him, hears the plan, and gets very worried. They telegram Sharrett, and Sharrett sees him in Syria in the next, he obviously was waiting for the train, and on the next station he gets, and he gets on and fools Brand that they're all waiting for him in Jaffa. The train passed through Jaffa. But actually what happened is he tells the British police about this, and the British police arrests Yoel Brand and takes him to Cairo. In Cairo, he's given a villa, which he can't leave, of course, but a very nice villa. And Moyne and his officers have a very long discussion with him. And they realize what Himmler wants. Himmler wants them on the same side, and the Americans. Churchill, who is told by Moyne about it, says, "I'm really worried about this mad idea, because if Stalin finds out about it, we'll be in real trouble. Let's ask the Americans." The Americans are also worried about Stalin finding out, and they decide to arrest Yoel Brand and not let him to get back to Palestine, or of course to Germany. In a dinner, when this is discussed between American, British, and French diplomats by Moyne, at this dinner also Yoel Brand speaks, and he had decent English, and he explained the plan to them. And then Moyne turns to him and says, "Okay, I understand the thing about the lorries. That all makes sense to me. But what are you selling us? What are we going to do with 1 million Jews? We don't want 1 million Jews." Brand is quite shocked by this, because he was told by the Nazis that this is what the British want. They want the Jews, and Zionism wants the Jews. But here he finds that neither the Zionists that actually fooled him, nor the British, nor the Americans want any Jews, let alone 1 million Jews. And he ends up in prison. And then after the war, he ends up in Palestine. Meanwhile, his wife is, of course, now with Kasztner. Kasztner is becoming the best friend of Eichmann. And one of the underlings of Eichmann is a colonel called Kurt Becher. And he becomes the best friend of Kurt Becher. In the meantime, they say, "Okay, we haven't heard from Palestine. We haven't heard from Moyne. Let's start the operation." And they start the operation. And Kasztner gets the job of telling the Jews by the in the station. You are going to a place called Kanya Maje, which means a maize field in Hungarian, where you will work until the end of the war. And actually, Kasztner does better than that. He's giving everyone that goes onto the plane a postcard and says, when you arrive to Kanya Maje, write back to your family so that they don't worry. How did they get the Jews to come? Kasztner told them that they are being sent to an agricultural camps in the East. Nothing will happen to them, like nothing happened to them until now. So be there on time, get a good place on the train, and you will be in Kanya Maje in a few hours. Now, Kasztner didn't just do it for his friendship with Eichmann. Eichmann promised him the Kasztner train. 6,000 Jews, or rather, it started with 1,500. And Kasztner then negotiated it up to 3,000. And after 2 weeks, Eichmann allowed him another 3,000. So obviously, he knew something about negotiating. And he was given anyone that he wanted to save, So he started the Kasztner list. And I know some of the people who actually were on the train. And I think Stephen Kaposh, that was going to speak today, but we don't have him now, unfortunately. His father was on that train, on one of the trains. There were, I think, 4 or 5 trains. And Kasztner put all the Zionist officialdom, all his friends and families, and people understood what is happening and started buying places on the train. So anyone on the train had to have a bit of money because Kasztner was selling those places. The last chapter of this, the train, by the way, did not go as it was promised to Switzerland. It went to a camp in Germany, and the camp actually had a special section in it, so they did not intermingle with the other Jews already held there. But they spent a few months totally safe because Eichmann wanted to hold this as a card against Kasztner because he didn't trust him, quite rightly. Kasztner actually did a very important job then. There were so many, there was so much money and other valuables collected from the Jews of Hungary that there was a special train called the Gold Train. And they actually needed to hide the gold because they were losing the war. And Kurt Becher is chosen to do this job, and Kasztner goes with Kurt Becher on a trip with the Gold Train for 6 weeks. We don't know what happened to it, but Kasztner got his part in the Gold Train, and this is what he brought to the Zionist Federation and then to Israel, where he was accepted with great pride and was seen as a savior of Jews, the 6,000 Jews that he saved. And of course, without the train of 6,000, it wasn't possible to put the million, or not a million, 800,000 in the end, on the other trains to Auschwitz. So this was a deal between a Zionist or the Zionists in Hungary, headed by Kasztner, and the Nazi party and Eichmann, to make sure that they saved the Zionist officialdom at the cost of, you know, making the victims 800,000 Jews that didn't know what's happening and thought that they are going to an agricultural settlement. So here we have a story about the worst part of the war, where this was the worst part for the Jews of Hungary, but it was the worst part for the Germans as well, because they were already on the run. And even at that point where they were on the run and under Soviet, you know, immediate occupation, they did not stop the destruction. And without the Zionist Federation in Hungary, this would have been impossible. Last part.
Yeah.
Last part. Kasztner arrived in Israel. He gets to be the minister of media. It wasn't called that then. It was radio and something. Yeah, radio and press. And the money ends up with the Mapai party, and everything seems to be okay. But some people have actually survived Auschwitz, like my parents, and they recognize Kasztner. And one important Jew, Malkiel Greenwald, calls him a traitor because he has basically handed 800,000 Jews to the Nazis. The government actually takes Malkiel Greenwald to court for defaming the hero Kasztner, the savior of the Jews. And it all ends up as a Kasztner trial, not as Greenwald trial. And in the end, Kasztner is the one that is found to be one that sold his soul to the devil, as the trial ends with. I'll just say that Kasztner is killed less than a year afterwards, apparently by two Mossad people from they themselves were survivors, and they may not have understood the whole plan, but they understood the order, and they killed Kasztner because he has become a problem. I can't tell you the whole story because there's no more time, but just think about what you have in that one little story of few months at the end of the war. Kasztner also saved a number of Nazis, including Kurt Becher, because he gave him an affidavit that Kurt Becher was a great friend of the Jews, and therefore he was freed from the Allied camp where he spent as a prisoner, and three other very important Nazis were also freed by Kasztner. Just think about what the Zionists were playing with. They didn't want the million because these were broken Jews, as they called them. So that wasn't important for them. They wanted their officialdom, they wanted Kasztner, they wanted the money, and they got it. Thank you.
Fine. Thank you. That's an absolutely horrific story, and a lot of people in the chat are saying, where can I read this? We're going to have your video up on YouTube, Haim, so in the Q&A we can come back on where people can find out more about that story. So thank you very much, Haim. We don't seem to have succeeded in getting Stephen into the meeting, so Tony, you're going to be our final speaker. You have 10 minutes. And then we'll take a break to look at Q&A before we come back to...
Yeah, I think I'll need slightly more than 10 minutes, but anyway. People can read about the Kasztner trial in all sorts of places. There's my own book. There is Ben Hecht's Perfidy, which was the first book. Hecht was a Zionist, a right-wing Zionist, but he pretty faithfully followed the transcripts of the trial. And if you ignore all the Zionist bits, then you'll see what outraged the Zionists by his book. They actually tried to buy up every copy so people couldn't read it. There's a number of different accounts. There's a very good one by Akiva Raw in a book called Perdition. And there's also a book by an appalling Zionist called Paul Bogner, called Kasztner's Crimes. Ignore again the nonsense about that fact that Kasztner was an individual rather than the representative, as he was, of the Jewish Agency and the World Jewish Congress, because when he went to Nuremberg, his expenses were paid by the World Jewish Congress and the Jewish Agency. And he freed not only Kurt Becher, but two of Eichmann's closest butchers, Dieter Wisseny and Hermann Krumi, who was Eichmann's second in command in Hungary, who was in charge of the nuts and bolts of the extermination, the deportations, arranging the times of the trains and so on. But I wanted to really comment more widely, in a sense, because we see the way that the Holocaust and anti-Semitism is being weaponized constantly throughout Israel's genocide, as we witness the massacre of Palestinians, the complete destruction of civil society, the attack on the hospitals, for instance. I remember reading the book, the Grey Book, I think it was called, describing how the fascists in Budapest attacked two Jewish hospitals. And it was described at the very end of the occupation, because between October and January, the fascist Neolas, the Iron Cross, took power, and fascist hordes basically assassinated someone. Basically assassinated the doctors and the patients in two hospitals and killed them, and that was described as one of the blackest deeds of the war. And yet we've seen Israel repeatedly attack hospitals. They've just bombed the third floor of the Kamal Adwan hospital. They bombed tent encampments outside the Al-Aqsa hospital, literally burning alive people in those tents. So, I mean, the horrors of northern Gaza are equivalent in many ways to the Holocaust. And yet Western leaders say absolutely nothing about it. But they were massively concerned, of course, about the violence in Amsterdam. It was even compared to Kristallnacht. I mean, it's quite amazing, because I wasn't aware at Kristallnacht the Jews of Germany had gone round chanting "Death to the Aryans" or "Death to the Germans," or "May your houses and villages burn," or attacking individual Germans. I mean, the idea that you can compare the Nazi pogrom to what happened in Amsterdam is really absolutely obscene. But it's a sign of the cynicism of the ruling class in the West. People like von der Leyen, Keir Starmer, of course, our own puppet foreign minister, David Lammy, Biden, and the rest of them. But I have no doubt that if we could project ourselves back 90 years and von der Leyen was about, she would be a member of the German Conservative Party that put Hitler in power, because it was the German Deutsche National Volksparty, which formed an alliance with Hitler, if you remember. Von Papen, its leader, was a deputy Führer. He believed he could tame Hitler, but Hitler had other ideas. Likewise, the British, they may go on about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust now, but the Labour Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, set his face against admitting any Jewish refugees at all, with the result that 2,000 who were trapped in Vichy, France, in the Vittel camp were deported to Auschwitz because he refused to admit them. So the pious hypocrisy of Western leaders now contrasts with the record of the bourgeois leaders at the time. And I have no doubt if they were there then, they would repeat exactly what is done. So the lessons they draw are very specific ones, and they have nothing to do with the record of their states. And I've just had published in Al Jazeera an article on why the German state is so avid in its support of Israel. And in essence, the German state has been involved in a whole number of Holocausts, the East African Holocaust, the Holocaust in Southwest Africa, the Armenian genocide it was integrally involved in, and of course the Nazi Holocaust itself. So it's not any surprise that it smiles upon the Israeli Holocaust. Indeed, it must give it a great deal of pleasure that the victims of the Nazi Holocaust are now perpetrating their own Holocaust. It kind of justifies everything that they've done. So this is the kind of hypocrisy we are dealing with. But this webinar came about because Jonathan Friedland wrote a biography of Rudolf Werber, who, with Alfred Wetzler, was the second and third Jewish prisoners to escape from Auschwitz on the 10th of April. And they reached Slovakia on the 24th of April 1944, where they met massive obstruction. And Werber made clear his hostility to the Zionist, Kasztner in particular, but not just Kasztner, because they wrote down something called the Auschwitz Protocols, or the Rudolf or the Werber-Wetzler report, which gave for the first time a detail of the outline of Auschwitz, that it was an extermination, not a labor camp. And he expected that when this report was handed to Kasztner, which it was at the end of April 1944, that it would be distributed and circulated widely within Hungary. But of course, that did not happen, because as Chaim has mentioned, Kasztner was involved in negotiations with Eichmann about a safe train out of Hungary for the Zionists and the Jewish elite, the rich, and so on. And so the last thing he wanted to do was to upset those negotiations by distributing a report to the ordinary Hungarian masses. I mean, Zionist historian Yehuda Bohr, who's just died, who was the chief Holocaust historian of theirs, justified this by saying, well, they wouldn't have taken any notice of it anyway, that knowing is not knowing, that knowing is not knowledge. But this is nonsense. A number of people have said, including Eli Wiesel, who was ardent a Zionist as you could possibly have said that if they had known where the deportation trains were going, they would not have got on. They would have taken advantage of the offer of ordinary Hungarians to hide them in the mountains and so on. There is absolutely no doubt that far more of Hungary's Jews would have survived. As it was, 437,000 of them were deported to Auschwitz, where the vast majority of them were exterminated. But Friedland, I wondered why, as the Guardian Zionist gatekeeper, should choose of all people to write a biography of Rudolf Werber. And the reason became clear when I started to read the book. And it was clear that what he was doing was a quite subtle justification of what the Zionists had been doing to Werber, because Werber's book, I Escaped from Auschwitz, or I Cannot Forgive, which was published in virtually every language worldwide, was not published in Israel till the end of the 1990s, when an Israeli education professor, Ruth Lynn, happened to meet him at British Columbia University and was entranced by his story and ensured that he was both given an honorary doctorate at Haifa University, but also his book was published. But Yad Vashem, the so-called Holocaust Museum, which is really just a propaganda outlet in Jerusalem for visiting diplomats, racists, neo-Nazis, and the like, refused to print his book, as they had refused to print Marek Edelman, the leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance's book, as they had refused to print Raoul Hilberg, the most distinguished Holocaust historian has ever been, his Destruction of the Jews, because the messages they conveyed were not the ones the Zionists wished to hear. So the Zionists and the Israeli state have been embarked on a very serious rewriting of the Holocaust to fit in with their own message. And that message, in essence, is it's not never again for everyone, but never again for the Jews only, in the words of Yehuda Alkner. But I just wanted to comment on some of the things that Jonathan Friedland, who I've described elsewhere as probably Britain's most dishonest journalist, and he has a lot of competition, so it is quite an accolade. In his book, Friedland notes that the escapees' two names had been anonymized because wherever they were written about in Israeli history, they were described as two Jewish escapees, two Jewish chaps, and other forms, but never by name. Yet he found this acceptable, quote, because he was not an easy sell in Israel or in the mainstream Jewish diaspora. Well, that begs the question, what exactly was being sold? In the mainstream Jewish diaspora, his books were widely available. In fact, they were serialized in the Daily Herald in 1961, so he was well known in the diaspora. But in Israel, no mention whatsoever in school history texts was made of Weber or Wetzler.
Tony,
what
we're batting up to the 10-minute break.
Right. Okay, I'll just, you can give me another 5 or so minutes, I'm afraid.
Well, can I leave you then, because I need to leave the meeting for 10 minutes. Shall I leave you to finish that? And so for the audience, we're going to have the panelists are going to review the Q&A after Tony's spoken, and then we'll resume with questions from the floor and contributions from the floor at 20:15. So Tony, you can carry on.
Yes, I mean, in Friedland's view, the problem was that Weber had made a hinted suggestion that Zionism was prepared to sacrifice the massive European Jewry in order to establish the Israeli state. Well, that's exactly what Ben-Gurion said, and that's in his official biography by Shabtai Teva. It is a job of Zionism not to save the remnant of Israel in Europe, but rather to save the land of Israel for the people and the Yeshuv. And as Marek Edelman of the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance said, during the war, it never even entered any of our minds that the Zionists were deliberately remaining passive in regard to the physical destruction of the Jews in order to additionally justify the founding the state of Israel. And that was one of the reasons why when Marek Edelman died in 2008 in Poland, he was given a state funeral. The president gave the oration. It was a 15-gun salute, but not one single representative of the Israeli state was there, or any of the associated Holocaust organizations that they run. And Friedland justified Weber's silencing because handing a platform to Weber may have come to seem like a risk. The question is, a risk to whom or to what? The truth or the Zionist rewriting of Holocaust history? And Friedland suggests that he should have softened his message to make it more palatable. I mean, I could go on, but I've got other things I very quickly want to say. I mean, the Holocaust has been used to exceptionalize Jews as unique victims of racism, which is absolutely nonsense, of course. The Holocaust, including the Nazi Holocaust, had many victims. The Roma, Sinti were equally victims and died proportionally in the same numbers as the Jews. Arguably, the Holocaust began with the so-called euthanasia campaign directed at Germany's disabled. And of course, with the 3 million plus Russian prisoners of war, plus 20 million Russian civilians. Vital components of Holocaust historiography were the idea of uniqueness. What made, in Yehuda Bohr's words, the Holocaust unique was the motivation of the murderers, and that the Nazis were a political elite that had come to power with pseudo-messianic concepts of saving humanity from the Jews. But that really is absolute nonsense. If you look at the period 1930 to 1933, as other Holocaust historians have, and which even Yehuda Bohr accepts, the Nazis made virtually no mention of the Jews. Their platform was mainly anti-communist. It had nothing to do with the Jews at all. Hitler's obsession with the Jews was because he saw them as the biological parents of Bolshevism. For Zionism, the Holocaust was inexplicable, because if you could explain the Holocaust, then it would have been possible, and it would be possible, to oppose anti-Semitism. But for the Zionists, anti-Semitism is inherent in the non-Jewish DNA, as it were. The Zionists were quite clear about their use and abuse of the Holocaust. Drawing universal lessons from the Holocaust meant the plunder of Jewish moral capital, and that's in Peter Novick's The Holocaust in American Life. Gerhard Riegner, who was a representative of one wing of the Zionists, I think it was the World Jewish Congress, declared that Auschwitz was not only a national memory belonging to the Jewish people, it was also an important political asset, and that can be found in Tom Segev's The Seventh Million. Edith Zertel, a political scientist in Israel, in her book The Politics of Nationhood, described how the transference of the Holocaust situation onto the Middle East reality not only created a false sense of the imminent danger of mass destruction, it also immensely distorted the image of the Holocaust, dwarfed the magnitude of the atrocities committed by the Nazis, trivializing the unique agony of the victims and the survivors, and utterly demonizing the Arabs and their leaders. Because for Zionism, it wasn't the Nazis, it was the Arabs who were the main enemy. And in fact, the Arabs have been consistently called the new Nazis. And in his attempt by the Zionists, by Yehuda Bohr in particular, to say that the Holocaust only applies to Jews, I mean, he described the Nazi targeting of gypsies as because of their tendency to criminality and wandering around. And in a debate with Sybil Milton, who was the chief resident historian of the US Holocaust Museum, herself Jewish, she just responded in a debate, defining an entire ethnic group as antisocial and criminal is a classic example of racism. I do not know why Mr. Bohr does not understand this. Well, the reason is, of course, because Zionism draws such different lessons, if you like, from the Holocaust. And I'd like to just finish with Yehuda Alkner, who was a child survivor of Auschwitz and a former rector and president of the Central University in Budapest before Viktor Orban forced it out. And he wrote in a famous article, The Need to Forget, that is the Holocaust, in 1985, he wrote, a profound existential angst fed by a particular interpretation of the lessons of the Holocaust, that we are the eternal victim. In this ancient belief, I see the tragic and paradoxical victory of Hitler. Two nations, metaphorically speaking, emerged from the ashes of Auschwitz. A minority who assert this must never happen again, and a frightened and haunted majority who assert this must never happen again to us. So I will leave it there, just to say thank you very much. And I hope that this webinar has gone some way, at least, to explaining how Zionism, in its genocidal capacity today, and that should be very clear with what it's doing in northern Gaza now, is utilizing the Holocaust to justify its own Holocaust, and I can't really think of anything more obscene. I also noticed that Stephen Kapos has joined us. I would hope that he would also be able to speak for at least 10 minutes, even if that does reduce the time for question and answers. But once again, many thanks. If Esther isn't here, then I suggest that Stephen simply start speaking. And ask co-host, I'm asking you to unmute, Stephen. Right, Stephen.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I'm sorry I'm late joining, but I had technical problems. The link that just didn't work for me. Anyway, I am now speaking on my iPhone, so probably it's not as brilliant. Unfortunately, I haven't heard the previous contributions, but what I like to add is a sort of personal connection to some of the difficulties and tragedies that the Zionists caused during the Holocaust, with reference to my own family. This is relating to the Kasztner issues. I don't know if Kasztner was mentioned earlier.
Yeah, it was.
But a big part of my family lived in Transylvania, and when Transylvania was reattached to Hungary as a gift from Hitler to the Hungarian ruler Admiral Horthy, suddenly the dangers to Jews in Transylvania increased, because the Hungarian fascists were far more violent and extreme compared with the Romanians. And so when they reattached this part of Transylvania where my family lived, suddenly came under much greater danger. And they haven't appreciated fully what the dangers were. But some of the workers on some of the land on which they farmed realized it, Romanian workers, and suggested that they should, the Romanians should take them across the border illegally, with using horse-driven cart transport to greater safety, because they were worried that this family would be victimized. Because they didn't appreciate how great the danger was, they turned this offer down, because there was a member of the family, an elderly person who they thought couldn't take the journey. And so they stayed, and then they were transferred shortly after that into a most awful ghetto situation, and an old brick factory was used as a ghetto and holding camp, and from there they were taken to Auschwitz. All of them died, every one of them. The children, the adults, everybody. So here was an example. If Kasztner had not had back the information about the acute dangers, they probably would have accepted, even with the difficulty to the elderly person, they still would have accepted the escape route. So that was one kind of brush with Kasztner that we had as a family. And the other one was my father and uncles were on the last stages of the Kasztner transport. There was a previous transport which rumors said it was successful, and you could sign up to a Kasztner transport which was trying to save about 2,000 mainly Transylvanian Jews, by a deal with the Nazis to be transported via Belgium to Switzerland. By something like December 44, one transport did in fact end up in Switzerland. This was a very questionable deal, because any deal with the Nazis is a degree of collaboration. And the Nazis demanded all kinds of goods and money and jewelry and socks and all kinds of things in return. So it was a kind of complete deal. So it so happens that my father and a couple of uncles fell into this last transport, which was going via Belgium. They did arrive to Belgium, but somehow the whole deal was not with the agreement of Hitler. When he discovered it, he stopped the whole thing, and some of the Nazi leaders, including Kaltenbrunner and others, were very nearly arrested for it. So that they were stuck in Belgium and then eventually transported to Theresienstadt, where they were liberated. But it was a narrow escape. My father had serious illness in Theresienstadt, etc. So there is, on the one hand, there is this question of with the Nazis, which Kasztner obviously did, and he was just about the only Jew in Budapest who was allowed not to wear a yellow star, for example, and he was in and out of the Nazi headquarters and on excellent terms with them. But they did survive, as it happens, and so it's a very questionable issue. But one of the things that, in retrospect, I wonder about, and obviously I wasn't fully aware of what is going on at the time as it was happening, although I knew that my father was taken to Belgium, because I was only 7 years old and I didn't fully understand the implications of the difficulties. But can you imagine having to trust a deal with the Nazis? And I wonder about that. How could they do this and go into it? And one of the answers I came to is that the alternative was even worse, because the Jewish the Jewish males generally, if they were within a certain age, were called up into ancillary units, work detachments attached to the Hungarian army on the Eastern Front. And they were abused and racially discriminated against, of course, and they were used for taking up minefields. And about 10% only survived. So these were the choices. And I sometimes wonder if the choices made in the dark in Gaza by the Palestinian victims are not similar in some ways, having to trust various announcements from the enemy and just leave home and go to a so-called safe place, etc. That's all I really wanted to add to the meeting.
Question really is, could we not try as hard as we can to put things into a more of an accurate historical perspective?
Yeah, so words are important.
Words are extremely important,
yeah.
because they're the words that are trapping us in this conversation.
Yeah.
But the question is, can we change that without diminishing the bestiality, the terror?
Thank you. Well, let's ask a question: what words should we use? Because I know that Tom said that Zionism was a cult.
Yes, if I could just jump in. If I could just jump in and make very explicit, since I'm the panelist that did use the word cult, I use the word cult specifically and exclusively for Zionism, not for Judaism. I just want to make that clear.
Yeah, absolutely,
I
absolutely.
want to support what Thomas said. I think the question is very troubling for me. And I think you said many things, Matthew, that you haven't got the slightest idea about. Sorry to be clear about that, but I think we need to be clear. And you're writing off the word Jewish or Judaism is not to be written off like that. And we have a contrast between Judaism, which has an enormously rich and complex history that we can't talk about now. But I wouldn't listen quietly to you writing off the word Jew or Judaism because it's nonsensical. If you talk about a cult, as Tom has said, it is Zionism, which is the cult. It's not Judaism. And I don't want to start talking about anti-Semitic memes, but you have used a number of them, and I'm troubled by that.
Thank you, Chaim. Tony, did you want to comment?
Yeah, well, I don't think the problem is the way we use words. The problem is the realities that we face. Words are simply a method of describing that reality. Of course, the Zionism talks about anti-Semitism, when what it means is anti-Zionism. Zionism attributes to Arabs and Palestinians anti-Semitism as an explanation for their antagonism to what they do. But I mean, there is no foundation for that. We saw that in Amsterdam when we were told these were anti-Semitic riots. It's just strange that those who carried out the reprisals against the Tel Aviv Maccabi fans for everything they'd done in the 2 days preceding didn't seem to have ever attacked Dutch Jewry's inhabitants. The 14,000 Jews in Amsterdam were left untouched and have never been attacked. So it's a complete nonsense. Anti-Semitism was originally the brainchild of Wilhelm Marr and those around him, who believed that using the term Semitic, that Jews came from the Middle East. He got it wrong because Semitic applies to a language, linguistic definitions, not people. So he's wrong in every aspect. What he was doing was racializing the Jews of Europe and not accepting that they belonged where they lived and not, in his theory, in the Middle East. But I don't accept that words are the problem. They're the symptom of the problem, if anything.
Yes, yes, the fact that we don't have words, the right words. Okay, so I will take questions from Stanley and Verena. So Stanley, would you like to speak, please?
You might want to take more than one question at a time.
Yeah, I've got two. I've got Stanley and Verena.
Thank you. My name is Stanley Heller. I've studied this issue for many years. Worth mentioning, and you didn't have time to do it, is the trial. You talked about the libel trial, which turned into a trial of Kasztner himself because he was caught in all kinds of lies and nonsense. This is 54, 55. When it was over, and it took months, if I recall, the judge, a distinguished judge named Halevi, who later went on the Israeli Supreme Court, he was part of the Eichmann trial, he considered this for months and wrote a huge description of his verdict. And he said that Kasztner had made a deal with the devil. And, he was absolutely pitiless in what his description of all these terrible deals that Kasztner had made. Now, after that happened, the Zionist government, the Israeli government, could have said, well, we didn't know this, but now that we've heard this distinguished judge put all this out, now we are, Kasztner lied to us, didn't tell us the real situation, we're going to break with him, etc. They did nothing of the kind. They doubled down, even though a government fell, the actual government fell, had to be reorganized. They stood behind him. They took it up to the Israeli Supreme Court, and their argument was Kasztner was just doing the same things we always did to save a few, and Hungary was a lost cause and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's just absolutely disgraceful for what happened in the war and what the Zionists did in Israel when they had all the facts in the 50s. That's my comment.
Thank you, Stanley. Any responses from the panel to Stanley's observations there?
Right.
Well,
I think he described what we couldn't say because of shortage of time.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I know Stanley, and I've been interviewed by him, and he's a very adept scholar in his own right in these matters, and what he said is absolutely true.
Thank you. Well, we don't have any other hands raised, so I'm going to invite the panel members in turn just to sum up what they've said and what they've heard and understood during this meeting, during the final 15 minutes or so of the meeting. So we'll begin with you, Tom.
Thank you. In summary, I think that obviously the overriding issue is always how do we stop the ongoing genocide immediately, and in the longer term, how do we bring equality river to sea in whatever form that takes, some single state with everybody in it equal, which obviously by definition means the dissolution of the Israeli state, because the Israeli state does not exist in a situation where everybody is equal. Now, the way I think that we, all of us typically fall victim to the propaganda is that we tend to react, we tend to discuss, we tend to answer propaganda on its own terms. When we respond to some allegation, some news story, something, we tend to react in the context that it's handed to us.
Yes.
And I think that we have to stop, take a step back each time and respond to it on our terms. And the most important example, I'm sure that many of us on the panel and the audience here have been accused of anti-Semitism. The most powerful weapon Israel has is this slur. Now, assuming that the charge is in fact not true, we tend instinctively just to defend ourselves. No, I'm not anti-Semitic. I think this is a very big mistake. I think that we have to take a step back and look at it this way. How has Israel managed to use this weapon? Well, it's managed to use this weapon because it makes an intrinsic link between the nation state itself and Jews as Jews, not Jews that happen to subscribe to the Zionist ideology, but their DNA, so to speak, itself. Jews as Jews are owned by the Israeli state. Now, this is common bigotry. This is the equivalent of someone beating up a Chinese person because of COVID. It's exactly the same chemistry, except Israel reverses it to say, yes, you're right. The state is the same thing as the people. Therefore, if you attack the state, you are attacking Jews. We have to go on the offensive and accuse Zionism and the Israeli state of anti-Semitism. And its abuse of the Holocaust is a particularly grotesque example of this. But I think that it's important that we take this weapon and we turn it around to where it belongs.
Thank you, Tom. So we need to reframe questions that are asked so that we can answer the questions on our terms. Thank you. I'm going to go to Haim next. Would you like to sum up, please, Haim?
I will not repeat anything that Thomas said because I totally agree with it. And just go to say that Palestine is not the only thing that was colonized by Zionism. Zionism colonized the American mind, the British mind, the European mind. Most importantly, it colonized the Jews outside of the Zionist project. Until that time, until Zionism appeared in Palestine, Judaism is a very rich tradition, even in Europe. But you think about the Arab world and the Muslim world and put it together, there are many types of Judaism, there are many histories, but all of those histories are more than 1,000 years old, and some of them are more than 2,000 years old. So I reject the idea that Jews there are really no Jews and it's only a religion. No, it's a much more rich than that, without any Zionism whatsoever. So I think, we need to decolonize Palestine. We need to decolonize Washington, London, especially Berlin, where anti-Semitism is alive in the guise of defending Israel. Anti-Semites all over Europe are the best friends of Israel. So we need to decolonize Europe, but we do need to decolonize Judaism, because since at least 1967, and I would say even before, Jews have replaced their tradition, their history, their value system, their experience in Europe. They have exchanged it for Zionism. The deity was displaced by the IDF and the Zionist state, the militarized state. That's what happened to Judaism, and we need to reverse it. We need to bring back the traditions of the Bund. We need the modernized Jew of the 19th and 20th century was a radical being, was important in all societies where they lived. They were communists and socialists. Most of them were left, and these are the people that Hitler killed. So I think we need to create a Judaism which is going back to the values of 2,000 years of Jewish existence in the East and in the West, rejecting Zionism as an aberration, as an attack on Jewish values.
Thank you very, very much, Chaim. I'm sure that call is welcomed by everybody. And I think we'll go to Tony and then finally to Stephen for closing comments. Tony.
Yeah, I mean, following on from Chaim, there have been many Jewish identities in the past. The Bunds, as money lenders, traders, just like the Phoenicians, working class revolutionaries, and so on. But then what Tom calls a cult, I would almost call it a psychological madness, has overtaken Jewry everywhere. And Israel deliberately colonizes Jewish communities and its institutions. I mean, I was aghast to see, for instance, the Anne Frank house put out a statement about this terrible anti-Semitism on the streets of Amsterdam. They seem to forget that Anne Frank wasn't a Zionist. In her diaries, she described a cousin who was a Zionist as something of a freak. Her desire was not to go and live in Palestine. Her desire was to live in a free Holland. But of course, that's never mentioned. It's probably one of the reasons why she's not one of the heroines of the Zionist movement as a result. But if you want to turn, I mean, when I'm accused of being an anti-Semite today, my response is, well, if opposing genocide in Gaza makes me an anti-Semite, then I will live with it. If that's the price that has to be paid for opposition to the slaughter that's taking place, then it's a very small price. But in reality, of course, Zionism has always sought its friends. I mean, from the very start, Herzl, who described anti-Semites as their most dependable friends, the anti-Semitic countries their allies. A.B. Yehoshua, who's a Zionist novelist who recently died, in an article in the Jewish Chronicle back in 1982, he wrote, anti-Zionism is not the product of the non-Jews. On the contrary, the Gentiles have always encouraged Zionism, hoping that it would help rid them of the Jews in their midst. Even today, in a perverse way, a real anti-Semite must be a Zionist. And that was true. The origins of Zionism were not Jewish, they were Christian. It predated Judaism, Jewish Zionism by 4 centuries. It was a product of the Renaissance and the Reformation. And then this kind of theology of the Jewish return was part of Protestantism, because the Catholics would have no part of it. They saw themselves as the descendants of the people of Israel. And then you saw in the 19th century, people like Lord Shaftesbury and Palmerston urging the border deputies and Jews to adopt a policy of return of the Jews. And the border deputies in 1842 issued a declaration saying they wanted no part of it. They were fighting for emancipation, which came about in 1858. They didn't want to say that, yes, we are a guest nation living amongst others. That would be food for the anti-Semites. And we see, progressing up to 1917, Arthur Balfour, who was a virulent anti-Semite. He openly said he shared Cosima Wagner's anti-Semitic postulates. He introduced the Aliens Act in 1905 as Prime Minister to keep refugees from Tsarist Russia out. But the Balfour Declaration, the alliance of British imperialism, and the fledgling Zionist movement, which had virtually no support in Britain, was consummated. And we should all remember, on the Lloyd George War Cabinet, the only member of it who voted against the Balfour Declaration, accusing his fellow members of anti-Semitism, was Sir Edwin Montagu, the only Jewish member. So I think we should be clear that Zionism has never been a Jewish project. It's always been an imperialist project. And the British and the Americans adopted Zionism because they saw it as in their interests. And so, of course, they use Jews today as the kind of moral alibi, the colonial pawn, in the excuse for supporting Israel come hell or high water, or in Biden's words, if there wasn't an Israel, we'd have to invent it. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Tony, and thank you for drawing in those aspects of Christian Zionism that some of the comments have referenced. I don't know whether I agree or know enough to be able to say that Christian Zionism is also a form of anti-Semitism. I'm sure that it may be in some respects, but maybe there's some duping going on as well. So I think that's probably something, because a lot of people refer to it, that we need to look at in a little bit more detail in due course. So I'd welcome your views on it as well, panel members. But finally, we're going to go to Stephen. And Stephen, for your closing remarks, please. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
I just want to join up with Tony's remark about how Anne Frank considered some Zionists as freaks, because I come from the Central European tradition, where the Central European Jews were rejecting, by and large, overwhelmingly, I would say, Zionism, and regarded Zionists as freaks. They were more interested in integrating in the country where they lived and making a successful life. And even after the liberation, 1945, when many of the Hungarian Jews felt, in reaction to what was happening in Hungary, left the country, overwhelmingly they didn't go to Israel and Palestine, but Canada and US and almost everywhere else. So that's about Zionism. It's not something that has been a dominant or strong tradition in Central Europe, and certainly not in Hungary. And I just want to mention also about the word anti-Semitism. I think I agree that it is more a symptom. It's not the reality behind it does exist. And I think we know it when we see it. And there is a perfectly adequate definition of it in the Oxford English Dictionary. There was no need really for the IHRA definition, which is a complete, well, it really is merely justifying the suppression of criticism of Israel. And we mustn't forget that all those struggles, which started with weaponizing anti-Semitism, started within the Labour Party. I think we had this intense struggle first in the Labour Party, and then somehow it spread out more internationally in recent times. And the Labour Party has a lot to answer for in that regard, I think.
Could I just say one sentence to back up what Stephen said, which I think is very important?
Sure.
Before
Yes.
the Second World War, the percentage of Jews who supported Zionism in Europe was between 1% and 2% of every Jewish community in Europe. So Stephen is totally accurate in his description of the level of support that was given to Zionism by Jewish communities.
Brenton O'Brien asks, is there a book or books with the information we've heard? Yes, I've written Zionism during the Holocaust.
Yes. Yes.
Greenstein104@gmail.com. And also Tom has written Palestine Hijacked, I think it is, in the State of Terror, which again go through much of that. In my own book, Jana asks about Arthur Rupin and his role. I have a whole section on Arthur Rupin, who was a virulent racist and eugenicist. And someone called Anonymous says about the propaganda role of the Eichmann trial. Well, yes, read Hannah Arendt, and I also cover it again in my book. And someone's Iris asks about what Palestinians know their descendants of the peasant Jews. Yes, that's correct. Ben Gurion and Yitzhak Ben Savi, who was a second Israeli president, accepted that if anyone was the original ancestors of today's Palestinians, it was the Hebrews in Palestine who converted. So, I mean, today's modern European settlers have little or nothing to do with those who were originally there. So this kind of racial myth is exactly that. It's a racial myth. Ahmed asks about Netanyahu's claim that the Mufti of Jerusalem allied with Hitler to exterminate the Jews. There's simply no truth in it. The record of the meeting doesn't even mention extermination, and in any case, the Holocaust had begun 5 months earlier. Yeah, I mean, I think that's about it.
Can I just say one thing to the members before leaving? I made a mistake by talking about 6,000 Jews, and it was 600.
Yes,
you know, so I'm correcting this now. After a day of treatment, and I got confused.
Well, thank you, Chaim. I wish you well.